Everyone laughed when George signed up for the city marathon. Not because he wasn't welcome, not because he didn't try, but because George was 95 years old. And no one, not even those who claimed to believe in second chances and limitless spirit, really believed he would make it to the starting line. But George, he had something else in mind. He showed up to register in an old windbreaker jacket from the 80s, shoes that had seen better decades, and a gentle, unwavering smile. The kind of smile that made you pause, not because it was bright, but because it was steady. The young woman at the registration table had looked up at him, blinking in disbelief. "You're here for the marathon?" she'd asked, scanning the forms. George had nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Full marathon, no shortcuts, no relays, just me." There had been an awkward silence. "We usually ask for a medical certificate for anyone over 75, she said gently. "I brought it," George replied, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "And a letter from my doctor, and one from my granddaughter, who insists I'm insane." They both laughed, but no one else did. That night, George sat at a small kitchen table, a registration confirmation crinkled in his weathered hands. Outside, the wind hummed against the windows of his modest one-bedroom apartment. Inside, the silence was broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the sound of an old kettle on the stove. On the refrigerator hung a photo, yellowed at the corners, of a younger George, back straight, arm wrapped around a woman with fire in her eyes. His late wife, Helen. He looked at it now. "You once told me not to die with things undone," he whispered. Then he pinned the confirmation next to the photo. George didn't start running until he was 92. Not seriously, anyway. He had been an active man in his youth, walking to work, fixing fences, chasing his grandkids around the yard. But running, that had never been part of his world. Until Helen passed. Until the house got too quiet. Until the days got too long. He had gone for a break one evening and found himself chasing a bus. Not to catch it, but because for a few fleeting seconds, it felt like something was chasing him back. Grief, perhaps, or time. He'd run until he couldn't. Then he started again the next day. At first, the neighbors thought it was charming. Then they started to worry. One offered him a cane. Another left a pair of orthopedic shoes at his doorstep. But George didn't stop. He kept running, some days half a block, some days a mile. Until one Sunday morning, his legs carried him 6 full miles along the river path. When he came home, sweating, shaking, and beaming, he whispered, "You'd be proud of me, Helen." Then the idea took root. A marathon. One final race. Not to prove the world wrong, but to prove himself right. Word spread quickly after he registered. Some people were supportive. Most were skeptical. The local paper did a short feature, "Grandpa George aims for the finish line," accompanied by a photo of him tying his shoes on his front porch. The online comments weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. Why risk it? This can't end well. Admirably, but foolish. George read them all, then folded the newspaper and went outside. To run. His training became a routine. Monday, short runs with hill intervals. Wednesday, mid-distance jogs. Saturday, long, slow distances, sometimes up to 15 kilometers. Each run ended at the cemetery where Helen was buried. He'd sit by her headstone and catch his breath. "Still with me?" he'd ask. And in the wind, or the sun, or the rustling leaves, he always imagined she answered. Yes, always. 3 weeks before the marathon, George tripped on an uneven sidewalk. He scraped his knees, bruised his elbow, and knocked the wind out of himself. A man passing by stopped and helped him up. "You shouldn't be out here alone," the man said. George smiled through the blood and dirt. "If I'm alone, that means no one's in my way." He limped home, rested one day, then ran again. When the marathon bibs arrived by mail, his was number 4265. He stared at it, fingers tracing the printed numbers. 4, he said aloud, for the number of times I wanted to quit. 2, he continued, for the number of people who believed I could do this. 6, he whispered, for every decade you gave me love. And 5, his voice broke, for the years I've missed you. Then he pinned it to his training shirt and waited. The morning of the marathon came with cool air and pink skies. George arrived early, too early, but he liked the quiet, the hush before the noise. He stretched slowly, carefully beside runners half his age, some a quarter of it. No one recognized him at first, until someone pointed. That's the old guy from the paper. He's actually here. And there it was again, the laughter, the disbelief. But George didn't mind, because in his chest, beneath his rib cage, and behind every breath, was the fire that hadn't gone out. He touched his chest gently. We're starting now, Helen, he said. Let's go. They were cracked. The soles had softened with age. The laces were mismatched. One white, one gray. And on the side, a faint, faded logo barely visible anymore. They weren't running shoes by any modern standard, but to George, they were exactly what he needed. Because these shoes had history. They had seen decades of change, held steady through funerals, family barbecues, early morning walks, and now a dream George had once thought would die quietly, unheard. But the shoes still held, and so did he. The morning before the race, George pulled them from the bottom drawer of his wardrobe. He'd kept them there, wrapped in an old t-shirt Helen had worn gardening. He liked the way the cotton still smelled faintly of lavender and soil. He unwrapped the shoes gently, like relics. Well, he said aloud, guess it's time for one more story. He slipped them on. They fit like they always had. Not perfectly, but like they remembered him. At the starting line, the contrast was glaring. George, in his decades-old runners, stood among a sea of neon shoes, carbon plates, and sleek gear designed to shave off seconds. Next to him, a young man in his 20s glanced down and blinked. Sir, those your racing shoes? George looked at him, then down at his shoes. Well, he grinned, they're the only ones that haven't given up on me yet. The man laughed, but not unkindly. Respect. Want me to pace you for the first couple miles? George shook his head. No need, I'm running with someone else. He tapped his chest. She's with me. They fired the starting pistol, and just like that, the race began. Hundreds of feet pounded the pavement. Cheers erupted from the sidelines. Music blared. Energy surged. George took his first step, then another. He didn't run fast. His pace was a shuffle more than a stride, but he moved. He moved forward. That was enough. The shoes carried him. Mile 1 passed in a blur of elbows and noise. He stayed to the edge, letting others fly past him. Mile 2 was quieter. The crowd thinned. By mile 4, the street stretched open. He felt the rhythm now, the slow cadence of his breath, the whisper of wind past his ears, the subtle ache in his calves that he welcomed like an old friend. Mile 5. He stumbled, caught his breath, and kept going. People began to notice. Volunteers at water stations clapped extra hard when they saw him. You got this, Grandpa George? Legend. Those shoes are holding better than mine. He smiled, waved, and kept running. Somewhere around mile 9, a young girl, maybe 11 or 12, ran up beside him. Hi, she said, bouncing slightly on her feet. Well, hello, George replied. My dad says you're amazing. He says you're proving something. George chuckled. I'm just trying to finish. That's what he said too. That finishing is the most amazing part. They ran together for 2 blocks. Then her dad called her back. George waved goodbye, but something lingered, a quiet joy. He was being seen, not as a novelty, but as someone who mattered. Around mile 11, the blisters started. The shoes, for all their memories, weren't built for this kind of distance. He felt it in his left heel first, a sting, then a burn. The right foot followed, but he didn't stop. He adjusted, focused on the horizon, tuned into his breathing. In, out, one step, then the next. The sun began to shift. Runners who had long since finished began returning to the sidelines. Some recognized him. They clapped again, called his name, took photos. And George, still shuffling, still steady, nodded with gratitude. He was last, but he was still in it, still moving. At mile 16, the pain became sharp. He paused, sat on the curb, unlaced his shoes. His socks were soaked through, blood stained the fabric. He looked down at the shoes. "You've done enough," he whispered. A race volunteer approached. "Sir, we can call someone. Get you a ride to the finish line." George looked up. "Would you do that to your grandfather?" The volunteer smiled softly. "No, sir." "Then don't do it to me." He stood. Pain laced every step, but he moved. One block, then another, until the shoes, old as they were, began to move with him again. By mile 20, the sun began to dip. Shadows stretched long across the road. Spectators had gone home. Barricades were being packed away, but George kept going. And somewhere inside him, Helen whispered, "I'm still with you." So he smiled and pressed on. There are some things we carry not in our pockets, but in our hearts. For George, it was a letter, folded tight, a little worn, kept in the small, zippered pocket inside his running windbreaker. Not because it was practical, but because it was Helen's handwriting, and that was the only thing he had left that still looked alive. The letter had arrived 3 weeks after Helen passed. He hadn't expected it, didn't even know she'd written one. It came in a pale blue envelope with his name on it in the soft, slanted script he knew better than his own. The return address was his house. He sat on the porch for over an hour before opening it, afraid of what it might say, afraid of what it wouldn't. He read it only once, then folded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of the jacket he wore on his walks. But now that the marathon had begun, and mile after mile had passed, he felt the weight of the letter not as paper, but as pulse. So when he reached mile 21, with his legs aching and his breath shallow, he sat on the side of the road and opened it again. My George, if you're reading this, then I've already said goodbye, but this isn't really goodbye, is it? Because people like us, we don't leave each other, not truly. We carry each other in every step, in every thought, in every morning that comes after the world changes shape. I've watched you your whole life, steadfast, humble, stubborn, and kind. You were always the one who stayed when everyone else ran, the quiet strength in a world full of noise. But George, I want you to run. Run not because you're chasing something, not because you're trying to escape, but because you can. Because I know, deep down under that old weathered skin of yours, there is a heart that still wants to fly. Run for the years we didn't get to grow old together. Run for the children we raised. Run for the mornings we spent with tea and newspapers and no words at all. Run for me, but mostly run for you. And if you ever feel like stopping, just remember, I'm right there a few paces ahead, saving you a seat at the finish line. Love always, Helen. George folded the letter slowly, pressed it to his lips, and cried. Not the kind of cry that demands attention, but the kind that belongs to a heart cracked open. The kind of cry that comes when someone gives you permission to live again. He stood, wiped his face, slipped the letter back into the pocket over his chest. All right, Helen, he whispered, let's keep going. And he did. Mile 22 hurt more than all the others. Every joint screamed. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. A volunteer offered him a seat, a bottle of water, a soft look that said, "It's okay to stop." But George just smiled. "Thank you, son, but I've still got one more letter to deliver." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He was chasing something only he could see. Somewhere near mile 23, the sky began to dim. The city's tall buildings stood silhouetted against a deepening blue. The crowds were gone, the roads nearly empty, but someone had stayed. A little girl, the same one who had run beside him earlier. She stood on the sidewalk with her dad. When she saw George, she clapped. "You're still running," she shouted. He smiled. "Still trying." She held up a small sign she'd drawn with crayon. "Go, George, you're awesome!" His heart swelled. He waved, and the pain lessened just enough to take another step. Mile 24. He was walking more than running now, but he hadn't stopped. Each step was a declaration, a defiance, a love letter. As he rounded a corner, he passed a bench. On it sat a woman with white hair, watching him. For a moment, his heart skipped. She looked like Helen. Of course, it wasn't her, but the way she smiled, knowingly, gently, reminded him of every morning he'd ever woken up next to love. "You're almost there," she said. He nodded. "She told me I would be." At mile 25, his legs gave out. Just for a moment, he stumbled, fell to one knee. A medic rushed toward him. "Sir, please, let us help." George raised a hand. "Just let me breathe." He stayed there, kneeling, the pavement hard beneath him, the finish line still distant. But the letter in his pocket pulsed like a second heartbeat. He reached for it, held it against his chest, and whispered, "I'm coming. Just wait for me." He rose, unsteady, but rising nonetheless. A cheer erupted. He hadn't noticed the small crowd gathering. Volunteers, other runners who'd returned, staff, families, all watching, all waiting. For the man who wouldn't quit, the man with the letter. As he reached the final mile, something happened. A young runner joined him, then another, and another, until a small circle of people surrounded him, not guiding, not pushing, just moving with him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were bearing witness to a man finishing something that wasn't just a race, but a promise. As the finish line came into view, not because he had to, but because he wanted to remember this, the sound of feet beside him, the sky darkening above, the air thick with effort and hope, and the letter over his heart. He crossed the finish line, last, but not alone, never alone. Afterward, when the crowd had thinned and the road crews began dismantling the barriers, a reporter approached him. "Mr. Mitchell, why did you do it? At 95? Why run?" George reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded paper, and said simply, "Because someone I love once asked me to." Pain has a way of measuring time. For George, the pain didn't come all at once. It arrived in ripples, in quiet warnings, in the pull behind his knees, the strain in his lower back, the dull burn in his arches with each hesitant step. The first step, however, that one hurt the most. Not because it demanded strength, but because it demanded belief. The day after the marathon, George sat alone in his apartment, legs propped on an ottoman, a heating pad tucked beneath one knee, and a cup of chamomile tea in hand. The medal from the race hung from a nail beside Helen's photo. He hadn't taken it off since they gave it to him. Not because he needed the recognition, but because it still felt impossible. "We did it, Helen," he whispered, staring at the medal. "You and me." His shoes lay at the foot of the bed, muddied, scuffed, and torn in places. a badge of honor. But what the world didn't know, what the cameras didn't capture, was that his real race began long before mile 1. It began on a cold Thursday morning 3 years earlier. When George tried to stand and couldn't, it was after Helen had passed. The grief had settled like winter in his bones, heavy, quiet, relentless. He had stopped walking much, stopped going outside, stopped answering the phone. His daughter Emily came by to check on him and found him in bed, still in pajamas, the curtains drawn. "Dad," she had said, voice soft but firm, "you can't keep doing this." He didn't answer. She sat on the edge of the bed. "She wouldn't want this for you." He turned away. "I know." "Then why?" He looked at the wall. "Because if I stay still, I don't have to feel the world without her." Emily said nothing for a while, then stood and left a note on the nightstand. "One step, just one. Tomorrow morning, I'll call, we'll walk, just around the block." He stared at it all night. And the next morning, when the morning when the phone rang, he answered. "I'm up," he said, and took his first step. That one step changed everything, not because it erased the pain, but because it reminded him he could still move through it. Each day after, he added another step. 1 block, 2 blocks, to the post office, to the park. And one day, without planning to, he broke into a jog when it started to rain. It was awkward, shaky, but it was real. He came home soaked, laughed for the first time in months, and told Helen's picture, "Guess I still remember how to run." When George decided to train for a marathon, no one thought he was serious, but he was, because that first step had planted something, and over time it grew into discipline, into routine, into a quiet sort of hope. He set a schedule, bought a watch with a timer, mapped routes, read articles on posture, breathing, nutrition. He subscribed to a runner's magazine. The delivery boy thought it was a mistake. "This for you, sir?" George smiled. "That's right." But not every day was progress. Some days hurt. A lot. There were mornings his knees refused to cooperate, days when his lungs burned before he reached the end of the block, nights when he soaked his feet and asked himself, "Why am I doing this?" The answer always came back the same: because she would have wanted me to keep moving, because I still have stories left to run. One memory stuck with him. The first time he ran a full mile without stopping. He'd gone out before sunrise. The streets were quiet, dew still clinging to the grass. With each step, he repeated a mantra: "I'm still here. I'm still here." By the time he returned home, he collapsed onto the porch swing. Cried. Not out of pain, but out of recognition. He was alive. And that meant something. George started keeping a journal. Not to document his pace or times, but the feelings, the thoughts, the small victories. March 4th, jogged to the bakery. The woman behind the counter said I looked rosy. I think that means I'm sweating more. April 17th, found an old photo of Helen in her tennis shoes. She hated running, said it made her too aware of her own thoughts. I think that's why I love it. May 9th, my neighbor's dog barked at me again today. I think he respects me now. We've come to an understanding. Every page was a step, every word a mile. When he told his doctor about the marathon, the man nearly dropped his clipboard. George, he said, adjusting his glasses, with your age, bone density, and history of joint inflammation, this isn't exactly ideal. George shrugged. Neither was outliving my wife, but here we are. The doctor sighed. Well, if anyone could do it, it'd be you. Just promise me you'll listen to your body. George smiled. Only if it agrees with me. In the months before the race, George trained through pain, heat, rain, and fatigue. There were times he nearly quit. But always, always, the memory of that first step came back. That cold Thursday, that call from Emily, that promise to move even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. So when he stood at the starting line on race day, surrounded by strangers, George closed his eyes and remembered, not the 26 miles ahead, but the first step behind him, and the 1,000 others that followed. And he whispered, "Thank you, Helen, for the ache, for the grief, for the love, for the reason to move." Then the gun fired, and he ran. Not every fall is a failure. Sometimes the ground reminds us what we stand for. For George, the day he collapsed wasn't just a moment of pain. It was a test of resolve, of memory, of every promise he had made to himself since the first step. And when the world spun and the sky tumbled sideways, he remembered why he had begun at all. It happened during a long training run, a route he knew well, across the neighborhood loop, down past the bakery, along the Riverwalk. 12 miles was the plan. Nothing new. He'd done 11 the week before. The air was thick that day, unusually humid for late spring. George had woken up early, drank water, ate half a banana, and set out before sunrise. He moved slowly, letting the stiffness in his legs ease into rhythm. At mile 2, he felt the tightness. At mile 3, the sweat ran in rivulets down his temples. At mile 5, he forgot what song was playing in his head. And at mile 6, it happened. 1 minute he was upright. The next, the sidewalk rushed up to meet him. There was no warning, just a sudden lightness, then darkness. He came to slowly with the scent of pavement and the distant sound of birdsong mixing in his ears. Something wet touched his cheek. A dog's nose. "Oh my God, are you okay, sir?" A woman in running shorts knelt beside him. Her voice was panicked. Her hands hovered uncertainly. George blinked. "What happened?" "You fainted, I think. Just dropped." "I called an ambulance. They're on their way." He tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his left side. She gently pushed his shoulder back. "Please, just stay still. You're bleeding a little." George looked down. His arm was scraped, and his elbow already swelling. The payam, a golden retriever, sat beside him, tail thumping nervously. "He found you first," the woman said, breathless. "He just stopped running and led me right to you." George managed a small smile. Smart dog. Then he blacked out again. The hospital was too white, too cold, too clean. George hated hospitals. Always had. He stared at the IV dripping beside him, the heart monitor chirping steadily. His daughter arrived, pale and wide-eyed. "Dad," Emily said near tears, "you scared the hell out of me." He tried to speak. His throat was dry. She poured water into a cup, helped him sip. "What were you thinking? Running that far alone?" He closed his eyes. "It was just a run." "You're 95. That wasn't just a run, that was a risk." He sighed. "I've lived through war, Emily, through losing your mother, through watching friends disappear like morning mist. If I fall while trying to do something that makes me feel alive, so be it." Her expression softened. "I know, but can you maybe feel alive with a walking stick?" He chuckled. "I already have one. It's called Momentum." The doctor entered a few minutes later. "Mr. Mitchell," then he began, "you had a combination of dehydration, mild heat exhaustion, and possibly a drop in blood pressure. You're lucky it wasn't worse." George nodded. "So when can I run again?" The doctor blinked. "Run? Yes, I've got a date with 26 miles. Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, you just collapsed. And I just got back up." The doctor didn't smile, but he didn't argue. "Let's get you through rehab first, then we'll talk." Recovery was slow. George hated slow. Physical therapy was a mix of stretching, minor cardio, and balance work. He moved like a man twice his age. But every session he showed up early, did every rep, asked for one more. He brought the letter from Helen in his pocket, always. And some days, when the work was too hard, when his knees buckled, when his frustration threatened to boil over, he would step outside, sit in the sun, and read it. Then walk back in and try again. 2 months after the fall, he ran a mile, on a treadmill, in socks. His therapist cried. He didn't. He just whispered, "We're still in it, Helen." The marathon was still months away, but for George, the comeback had already begun. He adjusted his training, hydrated more, ran with a partner when he could, accepted help, not because he was weak, but because even the strongest need someone to catch them now and then. One day, the woman who found him, the runner with the dog, showed up at his door. She held a bag of energy bars and a water bottle with "Never Quit" printed in bold letters. "I thought you might want a better way to carry water." George smiled. "What's the dog's name?" "Lucky," he nodded. "Fitting?" She paused. "I've been thinking, if you ever want someone to pace with, I'd be honored." He looked her in the eye. "Let's try the bakery loop tomorrow morning." She grinned. "It's a date." The next morning, Lucky trotted alongside them. They didn't speak much, just ran. Quiet steps, shared space. George felt the wind on his face, the road beneath his feet, the rhythm of his breath. And for the first time since he fell, he no longer feared the ground, because he knew he could rise. The day he collapsed became a story he told, not with shame, but with pride. Falling, he would say, isn't the end. Staying down is. And then he would lace his shoes, stand, and keep moving, because some journeys aren't measured by distance, but by how many times you get back up. Some companions come when we least expect them, not with grand gestures or dramatic entrances, but with a simple question. "Can I run with you?" That was how George met Eli. 10 years old, shoelaces always half-tied, curly hair that refused to stay down, and a heart so big it barely fit in his little chest. It was a Saturday morning. George was on his usual loop, 5 miles through the neighborhood, over the bridge, past the schoolyard and back. It was quiet, the sidewalk still cool from the night air. He moved slowly, conserving energy, his body still adjusting from the collapse 2 weeks prior. As he reached the edge of the school, he heard quick footsteps behind him, light, uneven. A voice called out, "Hey, wait up!" George turned. A boy was running toward him, arms pumping wildly, cheeks flushed. He stopped beside George, panting. "Are you the old guy training for the marathon?" George blinked. "I suppose I am." "Cool," the boy said. "I am Eli. I'm 10. I want to run with you." George raised an eyebrow. "Why me?" Eli shrugged. "You don't run fast. I think I can keep up." George laughed. "Fair enough." And so they ran. At first, George thought it would be a one-time thing, a curious kid with a free morning. But the next day, Eli was there again. And the day after that. And the one after. He never asked permission, he just showed up. Sometimes with a granola bar, sometimes with a bottle of orange juice. Always with a question. "What's the longest you've ever run?" "Did you fight in a war?" "Do you think muscles have memory?" George answered what he could. And when he didn't have answers, he made them up. Eli never seemed to mind. One morning, George asked, "Why do you keep showing up?" Eli looked at him, serious. "Because my dad doesn't run with me, and you do." George didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and ran a little slower that day, so Eli could keep up. They became a pair. Neighbors began to notice. "George and his shadow," someone joked. Eli didn't care. He showed up with new socks one day, a gift from his mom. "She says I should support your knees too," he said, handing George a cold pack. George smiled. You're a good kid, Eli. You're a good old guy, George. As the weeks passed, their runs grew longer. George felt stronger, his breathing steadier, his joints more forgiving. And somehow Eli became more than company. He became rhythm. He became purpose. He became the sound of laughter beside George's quiet focus. And George, in turn, became something Eli hadn't realized he'd needed. A constant. One morning they reached the park and sat on the bench. George pulled out Helen's letter. Eli glanced over. "Who's that from?" "My wife." "She write you before she died?" George nodded. Eli looked thoughtful. "That's cool. Most people don't say what they mean before it's too late." George raised an eyebrow. "That's a heavy thought for a 10-year-old. "I read a lot," Eli said with a grin. Later that week, George noticed Eli didn't show up. Not that day, or the next, or the next. On the fourth day, George ran alone. His legs moved fine, but something felt off. The silence beside him was too loud. At the park, he sat on the bench and waited, hoping. A voice startled him. "He's grounded." George looked up. A woman stood beside the bench. Eli's mother. She looked tired. "Got into a fight at school. Defended another kid. Wouldn't tell the teacher why. Just said, 'I won't let people be stepped on.'" She smiled sadly. "He's always been a little too brave for his size." George chuckled. "I know the type." She handed him an envelope. "He wrote you this." George opened it. Inside, in messy handwriting, "I'll be back soon. Run slow so I can catch up. You're my favorite runner, even if you're old. Eli." George folded the note carefully, placed it next to Helen's letter, and whispered, "You've got competition now." The next week, Eli returned, wearing a headband. "I'm going pro," he declared. George raised an eyebrow. "Marathon pro? Life pro." They ran 3 miles that day. No talking, just movement. At the end, Eli said, "You know what's cool about you?" "What's that?" "You don't act old." George grinned. "You don't act 10. That night, George wrote in his journal, "Today I ran with youth, not just beside it, but inside it." The boy reminded me that some finish lines are shared, not in time, but in meaning. "Helen, I think you'd like him. He's got your fire, your honesty, and your stubborn little feet." We're still running, both of us, together. Some people run alone. Some find pace in partnership. And some, like George and Eli, find a kind of poetry in the in-between, where laughter echoes with every footfall. And friendship is measured not in years, but in miles. Some races end before we even arrive at the starting line. But George wasn't running anyone else's race, and he sure wasn't finishing it on their timeline. The sun had already started to dip when George reached mile 24. By then, the streets were nearly empty. The signs that once cheered runners on were torn down. Volunteers had begun collecting cones and dismantling water stations. Even the announcer's booth had gone silent. It was the loneliest stretch of pavement George had ever seen. But it was also the most important, because this part, this quiet, desolate, unwatched part, was where the truth of his journey revealed itself. Hours earlier, the marathon had started with great fanfare. Balloons, live bands, news crews. Thousands had run, hundreds had already finished. Photos were taken, medals given, feet iced. People were laughing, high-fiving, collapsing into each other's arms. But George was still running, slowly, painfully, deliberately. Each step measured against memory. Each breath a bargain with the past. At mile 21, a race official had approached him. "Sir, we're required to reopen the road soon." George nodded. "I understand." The man hesitated. "We can't guarantee safety past this point. We'll have to remove the support crew." George smiled. "That's all right. I've walked alone before." And then he kept going. Spectators had long since gone home, except for a few stragglers, an old couple in lawn chairs, A mother with a sleepy toddler on her hip. And Eli. Eli was back. He stood at the corner of mile 25 holding 2 water bottles. When George shuffled toward him, Eli ran forward. "Everyone else is done," he said breathlessly. George took the bottle. "But I'm not." "I know," Eli said. "That's why I waited." Together they walked mile 25. Side by side, George leaning on air, Eli pacing him without a word. People from earlier in the day began returning. A few runners who'd already gone home showed up in their race shirts. Is that the 95-year-old? He's still going? That's insane. Someone called a local reporter. A man with a camera jogged ahead and began filming. But George didn't care. He wasn't doing this for a headline. He was doing it because something inside him had not yet crossed the line. At mile 25 and a half, his body betrayed him. His left leg seized. He staggered, nearly fell. Eli grabbed his elbow. "You okay?" George winced. "Hurts like hell." "We can stop." George looked ahead. The finish line was still out of view. "We've come too far to stop now." He took a step, then another. And the pain, while sharp, receded just enough to let him continue. With a quarter mile left, something magical happened. A group of children from the neighborhood ran out to join him. Then came a woman with a stroller. Then a man on crutches. One by one they joined. Some ran, some walked, some just clapped from the sidewalk. But all were there for him, not because he was the fastest, but because he was still going. At last, the finish line appeared. It had been reassembled hastily by volunteers who couldn't bear to pack it away. The arch of balloons looked tired, but it stood. So did the crowd, small but loud. When George stepped into view, cheers erupted. "Let's go, George! You're almost there!" "Legend!" He blinked back tears. Every memory of Helen, every lonely morning, every aching mile, it all led here. He took Eli's hand. They crossed together. No ribbon, no timer, just one foot after the other, until there were no more steps to take. And when he crossed the line, the crowd surged forward. Reporters, former runners, spectators, children. They surrounded him, not with chaos, but with reverence. Someone placed a finisher's medal around his neck. Another gave him a folded chair. He sank into it, exhausted, but smiling. A reporter knelt beside him. "You finished last. How does it feel?" George chuckled. "I finished. That's all that matters." "What kept you going?" He looked toward the horizon. "A promise." "To who?" He placed his hand over his heart. "To her." Later that evening, George sat in the back of a quiet diner with Eli and his mom. They shared fries and milkshakes. His medal still hung from his neck. Eli looked up. "Do you think I could do it someday? A whole marathon?" George nodded. "Just remember one thing." "What?" "Everyone else might finish first, but what matters is that you finish." That night, George wrote in his journal, "Today I was last, but I was never alone. Helen, I made it. Not for the cameras, not for the record, but for us." And when they cheered, I think I heard your voice in the crowd, whispering as always, "Keep going." There are moments when a single act, quiet and unseen, echoes louder than a stadium of applause. For George, it wasn't the finish line that changed everything. It was the way people turned back. The morning after the marathon, the local paper ran a photo. George, mid-stride, holding the hand of a 10-year-old boy. His body hunched, legs trembling. But his eyes were alive. The headline read, 95-year-old finishes marathon last but not alone. The story spread fast. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. By noon, national networks were calling. By evening, a clip of George crossing the finish line had gone viral. No music, no filters, just raw determination. and a crowd returning to witness it. But George didn't know. Not yet. He was asleep, snoring gently in his recliner. Eli had fallen asleep on the floor beside him. His medal hung from a lamp. His running shoes sat quietly by the door, still dusted with dried sweat and glory. The next day, when George awoke, there were voicemails on his answering machine. Too many to count. Some from old friends he hadn't heard from in years. Some from strangers. One said, "You reminded me why I started running." Another, "My dad died last year. He was 91. Watching you brought him back to me. Thank you." Another simply cried, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." George listened to each one, then made tea, and sat with the weight of it all. Not the pressure, but the honor. He didn't expect what came next. 3 days later, he heard a knock. He opened the door to find a woman holding a tray of muffins. "You don't know me," she said, "but I watched you cross that finish line. I haven't run in 20 years. But I ran this morning because of you." George took the tray, stunned. "Thank you," he said. "That's the best race result I've ever heard." More people came. Notes, letters, flowers. A little boy from 2 towns over sent a drawing. "George with a cape. You're a running superhero." George taped it to his refrigerator, right next to Helen's photo. A week later, the mayor called. "Come. We're organizing something," he said. "For what?" "For you." "Oh no," George said. "No ceremonies, no speeches." "Too late," the mayor laughed. "The people already started it." The following Saturday, the city held a fun run. No timing chips, no winter podiums, just people running, walking, cheering in George's honor. He stood at the starting line, not to run, but to wave. His knees couldn't handle another 5K, but his heart could handle the joy. Children wore shirts that read, "Team George." Adults carried signs, "Keep going, run with heart." One woman wore a cape. On it, stitched in big letters, 95 and still flying. When the runners took off, George stood with Eli. "You started all this," Eli whispered. George shook his head. "We finished it together." Later at the park, people gathered. They shared stories. One man said, "My dad used to run with me when I was 5. I stopped after he died, but I started again yesterday." A teenager said, "I hated running. Then I saw you. Now I run so I can feel what you look like, free." A woman said, "I was afraid to grow old. Watching you made me look forward to it." George sat in a folding chair, listening, tears in his eyes. Not from sadness, but from the realization that he hadn't just crossed a finish line, he had opened one for others. A girl approached with a microphone. "Mr. Mitchell," she asked, "what would you tell someone who feels like they're too late to start?" He thought for a long moment, then said, "The starting line never goes away. We do." She nodded slowly. "One more question. Are you done running?" George smiled. "Only when my feet forget how to hope." That night, back at home, George placed all the letters and drawings into a box. He labeled it Momentum. Then he sat at his desk and began a letter. To Helen, "Dearest love, you always told me that one person could change the world. I never believed it was me, but maybe we changed a little part of it together. I miss you more with each mile, but I carry you now, not like grief, but like purpose. You were always my reason. Now you are my reach. Still running, still yours, forever." George, we spend our lives chasing finish lines. Some we see ahead, neat, marked with fanfare. Others we only recognize once we've already crossed them. For George, the real finish line came not with a medal or applause, but with a whisper, a quiet moment, and a realization that life's greatest distances are measured in meaning, not miles. A week after the community run, George stood on his porch, watering the potted violets Helen had once planted. They were blooming again, a soft purple, gentle and steady, much like the woman who loved them. Eli biked up the sidewalk, skidding slightly on the gravel. "You ready?" George looked up. "For what?" "Another run, just a short one today." George chuckled. "You ever get tired?" Eli shrugged. "You didn't, so why should I?" They started down the street. Not fast, just forward. Along the way, neighbors waved. Some clapped. One woman shouted, "Keep going, George!" He smiled. But inside, something felt different. Not wrong, not bad, just finished. As if the thing he had set out to do, the promise to Helen, the message to himself, had finally settled into place. At the park bench, they sat in silence. Eli kicked at the dirt. George sipped water. Finally, Eli said, "You don't run as hard now." George nodded. "I don't need to." "Why not?" He looked at the trees, the sky, the horizon. "Because the race isn't ahead of me anymore. It's beneath me." Eli furrowed his brow. "That makes no sense." George laughed. "One day it will." That night, George went through his journals. He read every entry, every run, every ache, every moment of doubt and every surge of belief. Then he picked up a fresh notebook. And on the first page he wrote, "This isn't about running anymore." He stared at the sentence, then added, "It never was." He spent the following days writing letters. To Emily, to Eli, to the mayor, to the boy who sent him the superhero drawing. Each one carried a piece of him, a story, a truth. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. Eli came over the next weekend, found George on the porch. "I brought you something," the boy said. He handed over a photo album. "My mom printed every picture she could find of you online, the race, the crowd, even you tying your shoes." George flipped through. There he was, laughing with Eli, grimacing mid-stride, raising his arms as he crossed the finish line. And then a photo he hadn't seen. Helen's photo, pinned to his shirt. Eli said, "A reporter took that one, thought it was important." George blinked back tears. It was. That evening, George sat with the album on his lap. He traced each photo with a trembling finger. When he reached the one of Helen, he whispered, "We made it, love. We went farther than I ever dreamed." The next morning, he didn't lace up his shoes, didn't stretch, didn't measure his heart rate. Instead, he brewed tea, sat by the window, and watched the sunrise. He felt full, complete. He still ached. His knees still creaked. But his soul was still. That afternoon, Emily stopped by. "Dad, you okay? You didn't go for your run today." George smiled. "I ran enough." She frowned. "But it's what you love." "It is," he agreed. "But loving something doesn't mean you have to cling to it forever." He held up a letter. "I wrote to you. Want to read it?" She took it, read silently. Then tears in her eyes hugged him. "You've always been racing ahead, Dad. I'm glad you waited for me to catch up." That night, George dreamed. He was running again, but not on a road. Through a field, sunlight everywhere, Helen beside him, laughing, weightless. When he woke, he didn't feel tired. He felt ready. A few days later, George called Eli. "Want to meet at the bench?" "Always," Eli said. They sat together, watching the clouds drift. George handed him a small box. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was George's medal. "But this is yours." George nodded. "And now it's yours." "What?" George looked at him, eyes kind. "Because you reminded me how to keep going, even when I thought I was done." Eli's voice cracked. "Thank you." George tousled his hair. "Just promise me something. Anything. When life gets hard, run through it, even if you're last." Eli nodded. "I will." That night, George sat by the window again. Helen's photo beside him. The wind whispered through the trees. He closed his eyes and said softly, The finish line wasn't the race. It was the love. It was the impact. It was knowing that when I stopped running, the world kept moving. And maybe I helped it. Just a little, he smiled. Then wrote one final journal entry. I ran a marathon at 95. But the real victory was learning that the end was never where I thought it would be. There are names we forget. And then there are names the wind remembers. George Mitchell's name was not printed in history books. He didn't build cities, write symphonies, or lead nations. But on one quiet morning, as the wind stirred through the neighborhood streets and the leaves whispered like old friends reunited, his name traveled, softly, certainly, on the air. It began with silence, no alarm, no morning shuffle of slippers across the floor, no kettle boiling. Eli was the first to notice. He had come, as he always did, with orange juice and new stories. But when he knocked, no one answered. The door was unlocked. Inside, George sat in his chair by the window, eyes closed, peaceful, hands resting on a notebook, one final page written. Helen, I think I've reached the horizon. I can't see what's beyond it, but I know you're there, waiting, and now my feet are finally light enough to join you. Thank you for saving me with your love, for giving me one last race, for giving me Eli. And if someone ever asks where I went, tell them this. I didn't stop running, I just finally arrived. The funeral was simple, just the way George would have wanted. No eulogies from strangers, no lengthy biographies, just people, neighbors, runners, friends, and Eli, who stood beside the casket with a medal around his neck and a letter in his pocket. He taught me how to run, Eli whispered, but more than that, he taught me how to stay. The mayor announced a park bench would be installed in George's honor, but the community did more. They created an annual event, the George Mitchell Legacy Mile. No timers, no rankings, just motion and meaning. People of all ages, all abilities, running, walking, remembering. Each participant received a ribbon that read, "Keep going." At the first Legacy Mile, Emily stood at the starting line. She wore her father's old windbreaker, Helen's letter tucked inside. As she began walking, she whispered, "I'm still following your footsteps, Dad." Eli ran that day too. He ran fast, not to win, but because his legs were filled with stories. He carried them in his heart, in his breath, in every beat of his shoes against the pavement. He imagined George beside him, running with ease, with freedom, with peace. The wind picked up, swirled through the trees, across the field, through the crowd. It touched each runner, each soul, and somewhere in that breeze, if you listen closely, you could hear a name, not shouted, not carved in stone, but carried, as gentle as memory, as strong as love. George. Back at George's home, the violets continued to bloom. The medals remained. The journal rested, open to the last page. And on the wall, a photo of George and Helen, dancing, laughing, forever young, still together, still in motion. And if you ever find yourself running alone, look up, feel the wind, and know some finish lines are not meant to be seen, only felt. The end.